Okay, so on to instruction and the question of what is the role of instruction in second language acquisition? Instruction. So here are four approaches that this section makes, actually. So it's more than the three that we typically have been seeing, but it really has to cover all the possibilities. So one is instruction makes no difference in L2 acquisition. One is instruction's role is constrained, which means useful to a point. The third one is instruction's beneficial, which is sort of unbounded, like beneficial, there's no limits, but beneficial. And then the fourth is instruction is necessary, as in it does not happen without. So, okay, here are the four positions again, and here is a nice little table. And I just want us to keep in mind the ideas of necessary and beneficial, because we talked about this with input and output, and in fact, is explicit and implicit information. If I put this little chart in front of you and I say, okay, where do A, B, C, and D go on here? Could you place them? Okay. So take a second and look at it and try to decide. Pause if you must, and put A, B, C, D mentally or on paper, whatever works better for you, into these boxes. Okay. So instruction makes no difference. Sounds to me like it's not even beneficial or necessary. So I would put A in the bottom right-hand box. B, instructions constrained in usefulness. Sounds like it's not necessary, but I guess it must be beneficial, probably. Instruction is beneficial. Doesn't say it's necessary, so it's going to be the top right box. And instruction is necessary. Presumably, it's in the top left box, right? Because as soon as something's necessary, it's beneficial. Obviously, so these ones we're 100% sure on, okay? If something is neither necessary nor beneficial, it's the bottom right. Instruction makes no difference. Instruction is beneficial but not necessary, top right. But if it's necessary, it's necessary and beneficial. So beneficial is when it's useful at all. I just want to point out, people have had this debate. I don't actually have a good answer for where B goes in this. My intuition is that it kind of lives next to the beneficial thing. I mean, I've had people try to claim it's the bottom left because I ask people this every year. So I'm going to say it lives next to C. That's really my opinion on the subject. But it's constrained. So you could argue maybe it's necessary and beneficial. It could even be the top left, right? It's necessary and beneficial, but only a tiny bit, maybe. So B is a tricky one in that sense. Okay. All right. But let's talk through the theories that make these kinds of claims. So let's start with it makes no difference. Instruction, whatever. Stick you in there, your sponge is fine. So Stephen Krashen's acquisition versus learning distinction, we'll call it, suggests that only input sparks acquisition, right? And remember, monitor theory says that acquisition are things that we actually can use in language, right? That my online processing sort of on-the-go use of language, and learning are the things I can tell you. In some sense, it's an implicit-explicit distinction, sort of. Right? He talks about the monitor being like when you're writing, you go, "Ooh, that's spelled wrong," and you fix it. That's what learning is to him. An acquisition or online language use. So Krashen would say instruction only affects learning / explicit knowledge, not your actual acquisition. So in Krashen's mind, they wouldn't be useful. So the evidence that he would put forward is that the morpheme orders that we talked about back in the chapter on orders, which I think was Q4. I don't remember anymore. But anyway, so you can't change your morpheme orders, right? The orders that you learned in it are the same. So in what he would say is therefore instruction is not actually changing your acquisition. Truscott 2004 also made the claim that there's no effective instruction. In fact, this person says only access to UG could possibly reset parameters, aka cause acquisition. So instruction is not the same as access to UG. And in fact, so our authors of our book, especially Van Patten, if you haven't picked it up already, are not terribly convinced of the importance of instruction. And so they would point out the following, that is in most studies that look at this, only the usefulness of instruction has only been shown in short-term studies. So for example, people will do what they call a treatment study. They'll have a pre-test. They'll try to teach you something, and then they'll do an immediate post-test and then a delayed post-test. So it goes something like, I do a pre-test on a Monday, I train you on a Tuesday, I do the post-test on a Wednesday, and then 3 months later I do the delayed post-test, right? And the idea is, do you learn the thing right after, and do you still know it 3 months later? And so what the authors are talking about here is that most of the studies of instruction find that on the immediate post-test, there's improvement for instruction. But a lot of times 3 months later, the gains in the instruction group have kind of flattened out. So it might give you some immediate improvement, like if I'm going to quiz you on it next week, I should teach it to you because you're going to do better on my quiz. But that doesn't necessarily mean 3 months from now you'll know a thing about whatever it is we studied. Okay. The longest effective instruction was seen in Van Patten Fernandez 2004, but even that had declined. So the improvements they saw in the instruction group were kind of waning. I don't remember if that was 3 months or 6 months, right? But in general, benefits from instruction, and especially explicit instruction, are short-term usually and not long-term. Now the second question was our B, that's hard to place. And this one is from Pieneman. This is the usefulness of instruction is constrained. Remember, we're talking about stages with Pieneman, right? It's like acquisition orders again. What Pieneman would say, Manfred Pieneman, he's got a great name. He would claim that instruction only facilitates the acquisition of the current stage or the next stage, right? So it helps you with what you're learning right now, or maybe pushes you towards the next one. So, and as a result, in possibility theory, which is a particular theory, there's a section on it in the theories section of our book. So not the questions, the section afterwards. There's a processibility theory section in there. And what Pieneman is saying is that, you have stages, kind of like morpheme orders and, those sorts of things. You have stages you have to go through. Actually, the negation thing we talked about even more so. And you can't learn them out of order. Instruction might speed you along a little bit in the same sense that transfer might speed you along a little bit, but you're not going to do them in a different order. If I have 10 things I want to teach you in Italian, and number 9 is really difficult, and you're on around like number 1 and number 2, if I teach you number 9, it's not going to make a difference. You might go, okay, cool, but you still have to go through all these stages, and then when you get to 9, you might be like, didn't you teach me this at some point? But it didn't change the order, and it didn't teach you 9 back here, right? Maybe if you're on 2 and I teach you stuff about 2, it speeds you along to 3. Right? So Pieneman would say that the role of instruction is constrained. It can help you with where you're at, but it can't bring things from further your development backwards into where you're at now. And again, I don't know what this says precisely about I think this means it's beneficial but not necessary, is what I think this would say. Again, next to C. So beneficial, speaking of beneficial but not necessary, all approaches that argue that acquisition is helped by instruction would also argue that order of acquisition can't change, right? So what we just said about Pieneman, we can't change the way or the order in which you learn things. I can't, teach you semester 7 things in semester 1 and expect you just to know it. And there's several people that had found this. Here's a set of people that would say, you know what, actually, and Norris and Ortega is very important. Keep that one in mind. They would say, actually, no, you really cannot change the order. They agree with Pieneman. But, and so but they would say that it's still useful, and more so even than Pieneman would say, right? So their emphasis is not, so it's kind of the same, except for Pieneman saying it's only useful a little bit in this case. Whereas they're saying it's useful, but it's not, it's not driving acquisition. So Long, 1983, Michael Long, did a small meta-analysis. A meta-analysis is when you look at other people's analyses and compare across them, right? It's kind of like if I took 10 people's studies and I said, well, looking at all 10 of these, this is the take-home point, even though 2 of them said something different or whatever, okay? A meta-analysis is analysis of someone else's analyses. Meta is like a level above. It's like, like if I had a hairdo made of hairdos somehow, like I took people's wigs and made it into like a meta wig. I don't know, that's a very strange example. But it's like, yeah. So same thing like if I made a cheese out of grinding up other cheeses. It's a meta-analysis. So what Long found is he compared classroom instruction, a group that just got classroom instruction, people who just got natural input, and people who got classroom instruction plus naturalistic input. And he found that instruction was beneficial at the intermediate and advanced levels. So when he says beneficial but not necessary, it was helpful when people were beyond the initial stages. In particular, he found that classroom outperformed naturalistic input and that classroom plus naturalistic outperformed naturalistic. It, he, he didn't directly compare classroom versus classroom plus naturalistic input. I have no idea why. This is always one of my qualms with this paper. I'm like, why? Okay. Anyway, so in general, the classroom was better than straight up input, with or without extra input. I don't know. So it was listed in a possible comparison only, but it wasn't considered important because it had to do with Krashen. He said, oh, Krashen claims won't test monitor theory, so who cares? Like, okay. So anyway, another one that claims it's beneficial is Schmidt. I forget Schmidt's first name, Robert, I think. Attention is necessary for acquisition to take place, right? So certain factors increase the likelihood of attention to a form. We talked about noticing theory in the explicit section, right? Frequency, perceptual saliency, communicative value, and instruction might in fact increase attention to otherwise difficult to notice forms. So if I'm trying to teach someone English and I'm trying to teach them to notice this at the end of certain verbs, me being like, hey, 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 there's a thing with the S. You should pay attention to it. Might make you notice it, right? So if you believe that acquisition is driven in part by noticing, then instruction would help with that, right? It's beneficial, but you could still notice it on your own, so it's not like it's necessary. You see where I'm going with this? And then Norris and Ortega, which to me is a very important meta-analysis, as a matter of fact. And notice that unlike Long, this is 40 studies, okay? So Norris and Ortega compared sort of different types of instruction among these 40 studies. And there were 3 broad categories: focus on meaning, focus on forms. Speaking of salience, there's an S on one of them, and focus on form, right? Focus on meaning in this meta-analysis was instruction that emphasizes meaning, okay? In that sense, it's almost kind of sort of holistic, right? So it's like if I were trying to teach you and I was emphasizing you understanding what was happening in the story, that would be focus on meaning. Or focus on forms. This is kind of the classic classroom, here's a verbal paradigm thing, right? Instruction that emphasizes verbal paradigms, or depending on your language, of course, not all of them have verbal paradigms. So it emphasizes sort of morphology and structure and memorizing such things, right? You memorizing endings. Because a lot of the studies that are of this type are on languages that have, verbal paradigms. A lot of them are Spanish, some of them are French, et cetera, et cetera. Not all. And then focus on form, no S. Is instruction that emphasizes verb endings categorically, right? It doesn't emphasize the paradigms. It's not telling you to memorize the endings. It's pointing out that there is in fact a pattern that you're like, oh, I see. Okay. But it's not testing you on, do you know whether the third person is different than the second person, different than the third person plural versus, it's not testing you on those things. It's not like a worksheet. It's like, do you see this pattern? Remember the pattern? Kind of. All right, now let's do some focus on meaning or something, right? So it emphasizes the existence of categories of, let's say, verb endings, for example. I think a lot of the studies in this were verb endings, but it did not ask them to memorize the endings. It was not an emphasis on those endings, okay? What Norris and Ortega found was that focus on form, without the S, I even wrote it there, right, without the S, was the most predictive of learning. That is to say, students in classrooms in which the verbal paradigm was shown, but they were not pushed to memorize or overemphasize memorizing endings or something of that nature, had the most evidence of learning. I know this is more fine-grained than what Van Patten's talking about in his other, like, short-term learning. They're not really talking about it at this level. And so I find this extremely important because this is a lot of data, There's a lot of data that goes into 40 studies, And they actually, they only could keep the ones that were comparable. Like a lot of culling went into understanding this data. My own approach to grammar in the classroom looks more like focus on form because of Norris and Ortega. This is not by chance. I spent a lot of time reading about this kind of things, and this is where I took home, right? Is that understanding how it works, more or less, is so much more important than me quizzing you on every single, I don't know, morpheme. Anyway, so that's Norris and Ortega. So Van Patten and Bonatti are not entirely convinced by this, right? So what they said is that Norris and Ortega actually took out too many studies in their meta-analysis. Because what you do is you take every potential study that could be part of this discussion, and you go through and you find the ones that are comparable, and then you actually research them, right? Then you actually throw them in a statistical model together, actually. Van Patten and Bonatti actually imply that these results that Norris and Ortega found were not valid because Norris and Ortega took out too many studies in their mind. Now, they still have 40 studies, so that's still a lot of data, but Van Patten and Bonatti are not convinced by this. I think they're being overly cautious. They might say they're being cautious in general. I think they're being overly cautious because Norris and Ortega's results don't line up with their theory of language, right? I told you at the beginning of this presentation, Van Patten kinda is on the crash and bandwagon about instruction a little bit. He changes tune slightly, but I mean, so anyway, so they're looking at Norris and Ortega's results in that kind of framing of it. They don't find it convincing, and to me, this seems nitpicky because this is how meta-analyses are done, and there are a lot of studies. 40 is a lot. You know, if you let's imagine you do 20 participants in a group and a study has even just 2 groups. That's 40 participants by 40 studies. So that's 160 people. But that's being extremely conservative. Many of these studies have bigger groups, and many of them have more than 2 groups. It's just a massive amount of data for them to be like, you were too conservative. Like, okay, then tell me which of the studies you wanted included. This is my question, okay? Anywho. So this is the last piece in the beneficial column. So under the necessary column, and obviously Van Patten and Bonatti are like, no, I don't actually think it's necessary either. I think it's helpful, I do. But I think you can learn without it. However, Higgs and Clifford, 1982, said it was necessary by comparing instructional methods that emphasized only vocabulary to those that emphasized grammar. And they found that the acquisition, so learners improved only minimally when the vocabulary was emphasized, which sounds a lot like focus on meaning versus focus on form, but you know. So they concluded that instruction was necessary. Okay, that's not a lot of data. Van Patten and Bonatti argue this position hasn't been in favor since the 80s due to other factors in SLA, and I agree. You know, not very many people would outright say instruction is necessary, but it takes a unique kind to say it's not even beneficial, right? Anyway, so, but you know, in general, the observation that Van Patten and Bonatti are pushing is something to say that, you know, learners don't become native-like in the classroom. Ergo, instruction clearly isn't the driving factor, right? The implication is getting instruction is common and succeeding is not common. So they probably don't correlate, is what they're trying to say. You know, they're also saying it's difficult to operationalize. It is to say, set it up as a variable in a study. Difficult to operationalize instruction without adding additional potential causal factors like input or interaction or even, you know, things like personality motivation. But it's true, instruction types differ by things of, you know, how much input's in there, how much interaction's in there, what kind of explicit or implicit's in there. It is very difficult actually to tease apart those strands when you're studying instruction. But does that mean you shouldn't do it? Anyway, so Van Patten and Bonatti would say, and this I do agree with, because you can't cleanly operationalize instruction all by its lonesome, you really can't conclusively say that instruction only ever caused someone's acquisition. Simply because there's always going to be more. Input will always be, you know, involved. It's, you know, it's impossible whether it was instruction or whether it was input. I mean, those things are so married. You know, it's hard to simply say instruction was the only thing that drove acquisition. So the assessment from Van Patten and Bonatti, instruction can alter developmental sequences. I agree. They conclude that it isn't necessary, but it may be beneficial. You know, I'm leaning towards beneficial. They're kind of light-handed on that. So they study the effect of instructions ongoing as instructional techniques evolved. I agree about that. You know, we have to revisit what does instruction look like? Why does it look the way it does? You know, in the 70s and 80s, we did autolingual methods and drilling, which is to say explicit, you know, say it. That's what autolingual is, repetition. It's very much how it used to be. Later developments included input enhancement, input flood, structure to input, implicit instruction, processing instruction. Processing instructions, Van Patten, although I use a little bit myself. But in general, our understanding of what can and should be instruction does evolve. And so this question isn't totally resolved. Notice that the differences between me and the author is where do you draw the line in the sand, right? Like, for example, I find something like Norris and Ortega convincing. The authors aren't totally convinced, Van Patten Bonatti. But it's not the case that we're proposing, outright that it can't help. That's not necessarily what we're claiming. They're a little more dubious, and I'm less dubious. But then it becomes a question of how, right? What does it look like? And that honestly is the bigger question. And there are studies on implicit versus explicit, like lots and lots and lots. As Van Patten Bonatti point out, those are a lot of the treatment, pre-test, post-test stuff. But those are exactly the kind of studies that Norris and Ortega were looking at and found that focus on form, no S, was useful. All right, so this is where I'm standing. You can see the authors and I are not exactly on the same page, but, near each other. If you have questions, let me know.